The silver of my father's cufflinks caught the candlelight as he raised his glass. "To the Vaughn family," he announced, his voice carrying across the dining room like he owned the air itself. I swirled my untouched wine, the red liquid creating small whirlpool patterns that mirrored the chaos in my chest. In my purse, folded into thirds, sat the letter his lawyer had sent 3 days ago. The one that began with urgent matter and ended with my signature line. The same signature he once told me would never be worth the ink it took to write it. I watched him smile at my brother, at the guests, at everyone except me. He had no idea I already knew everything. The bankruptcy filing. The falsified records. The desperate need for my mother's estate share that technically belonged to me now. 20 years of being invisible had taught me one valuable skill: I knew how to watch, how to wait, and how to remember every single slight. To legacy, my father continued, and the word tasted like ash in my mouth even though I hadn't spoken it. His company, Vaughn Industries, had been his pride for 30 years. Steel manufacturing, he'd say with that particular gleam in his eye, the backbone of civilization. He'd built it from a small fabrication shop into a regional powerhouse, or so the story went. What he never mentioned were the shortcuts, the creative accounting, the loans taken against assets that didn't quite exist the way the banks thought they did. I'd suspected for years, ever since I started working in accounting and recognized the signs. But suspicion and proof were different animals entirely. The letter in my purse represented his last desperate play. Without my signature authorizing the transfer of my inheritance share, his house of cards would collapse within weeks. The irony was almost beautiful. My brother, Kenneth, laughed at something our father said. They had the same laugh, the same easy confidence of men who'd never been told no. Kenneth worked at the company as Vice President of Operations, a title that sounded impressive until you realized it meant he showed up at noon and left by 3. "Teresa's always been the serious one," my father said, gesturing toward me with his wine glass. The comment landed like it always did, somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal. Serious. Quiet. Independent. These were the words my family used when they meant invisible, unimportant, easily forgotten. I smiled politely, the expression I'd perfected over decades of holiday dinners and family gatherings where I was present but never truly included. My father had no idea that serious meant I'd spent the last week reviewing every financial document his lawyer had accidentally included in that urgent letter. Numbers don't lie. People do. My mind drifted back to my college graduation, 12 years ago. The ceremony had been held outdoors under a blazing June sun. I'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in accounting, for years of perfect grades and late nights that left me exhausted but proud. After the ceremony, my family gathered at an expensive restaurant downtown. My father ordered champagne, made a toast to education and success. Then came the gifts. Kenneth, who'd graduated 2 years earlier with a business degree and mediocre grades, received car keys. A BMW, silver and gleaming, parked right outside with a red bow on the hood. I watched him whoop with joy, saw my father beam with pride. Then my father handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a calculator. Not even an expensive one, just a basic $10 model from the drugstore. "To practice your numbers," he'd said, and everyone laughed like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. I'd smiled then too, just like I was smiling now. I'd thanked him graciously, told him it was thoughtful, packed it away with my other belongings when I moved into my first tiny apartment. That calculator sat in a drawer for years, a small plastic reminder of exactly how much my achievements meant to the man who'd supposedly raised me. Kenneth's BMW had been an investment in his future, a reward for being his father's son. My calculator had been a joke, a dismissal, a way of saying I'd done exactly what was expected and nothing more. The praise I received was always qualified. "Good grades, but that's just Teresa." "Nice job, but she's always been responsible." My success was mandatory, unremarkable, while Kenneth's mediocrity was celebrated as brilliance. I learned to stop expecting anything different. I learned to stop expecting anything at all. At family dinners throughout my 20s, I sat at the table and listened. Kenneth's stories dominated every conversation. His work challenges that weren't really challenges, his social life, his opinions on everything from politics to sports. When I mentioned getting promoted to senior accountant, my father nodded once and changed the subject. When Kenneth got his VP title, we had a party that lasted until midnight. I was praised for being independent, for not needing help, for making my own way. What they really meant was they were glad I didn't ask for anything because they had no intention of offering. Independence wasn't a compliment, it was an excuse. They'd turned my self-reliance into a reason to exclude me, to invest nothing in my life while pouring everything into Kenneth's. I'd become the child they could ignore with a clear conscience because I'd never made myself a burden. I spent years believing that being invisible was a form of strength. That not needing them meant I'd won some unspoken contest. I convinced myself that their neglect didn't hurt because I was above needing their approval. I built a life carefully separate from theirs, worked my way up from junior accountant to senior auditor, paid my own bills, furnished my own apartment, celebrated my own victories in quiet solitude. I told myself I preferred it that way. That their loud, performative love for Kenneth was shallow and meaningless compared to my self-sufficiency. I was the strong one, the one who didn't need anyone. But deep down, in places I didn't like to examine too closely, I knew the truth. Silence wasn't strength. It was just another way of disappearing. And being invisible didn't protect me from wanting to be seen. But I was wrong about silence being a virtue. Silence only made arrogant people louder. It gave them permission to believe their version of reality was the only one that mattered. My quietness hadn't earned respect, it had earned dismissal. Every time I'd swallowed a hurt, accepted a slight, smiled through another casual cruelty, I'd taught them that I didn't matter enough to fight for. And they'd learned that lesson perfectly. My father had built an empire on other people's silence, on workers who didn't question, on accountants who looked the other way, on family members who accepted whatever scraps he offered. Well, I was done being silent. The letter in my purse represented more than just a business transaction. It represented every time he'd chosen Kenneth over me, every time he'd mocked my education while benefiting from his connections. Tonight, sitting at his table, I made a decision. This time, my silence would cost him everything. The breaking point had arrived 6 days ago, disguised as a professional email. The subject line read, "Time-sensitive legal matter, Vaughn Estate." I'd opened it at my desk during lunch, expecting maybe a notice about property taxes or insurance updates. Instead, I found a letter from Patterson and Associates, my father's legal team. They needed my signature to authorize the transfer of assets from my mother's estate into company accounts. It was described as a technical formality to streamline operations during a restructuring period. The language was deliberately vague, designed to sound boring and unimportant. But I was an accountant. I knew how to read between the lines of financial documents. Restructuring meant trouble. Technical formality meant legal maneuvering. And the attachment they'd accidentally included, a full financial breakdown, told the real story. My father's company was drowning in debt, and my inheritance was the last lifeboat available. That night, I packed a single cardboard box. Inside went my framed diploma from State University, the one that had cost me 4 years of work-study jobs and student loans I'd only finished paying off last year. My mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band she'd left specifically to me in her will, not to be sold or incorporated into any family trust. And something less tangible but more important, my self-respect. I'd spent too many years making myself small, convenient, invisible. Agreeing to things I didn't want to agree to because disagreeing meant conflict, and conflict meant being labeled difficult, ungrateful, bitter. I was done making myself easy to overlook. I carried that box to my car in the dark, the streetlights casting long shadows across my apartment parking lot. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wasn't going to save my father from consequences he'd spent decades earning. I left before dawn that Saturday, driving nowhere in particular. Rain drummed against my windshield, the wipers beating a steady rhythm that matched my racing thoughts. The highway stretched empty ahead of me, other cars just blurs of red taillights in the gray morning. I thought about my mother, gone 5 years now. She'd been quiet too, another woman who'd learned to make herself small in my father's presence. She'd worked part-time as a librarian, kept the house perfect, raised 2 children with vastly different levels of attention from their father. On her deathbed, weak from the cancer that had ravaged her body, she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Don't let him make you invisible," she'd whispered. At the time, I'd thought she was delirious from medication. Now I understood she'd been giving me permission to fight back. The rain intensified, and I pulled over at a rest stop, sat in my car watching water stream down the windows, drowning out the past. For the next 8 years after that graduation calculator, I worked quietly. I built my career one client at a time, one tax return, one audit, one late night reviewing spreadsheets until the numbers blurred. I worked for a mid-sized firm downtown, handling accounts for small businesses and individuals. My clients paid on time because I was thorough, honest, and never promised miracles I couldn't deliver. I didn't schmooze or network or play political games. I just did the work, and did it well. My reputation grew slowly, built on competence rather than charisma. No drama, no shortcuts, no creative interpretations of tax law. Just truth on paper, numbers that added up the same way every time you checked them. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody made movies about accountants who filed accurate quarterly reports. But it was solid, reliable, mine. I'd built something that couldn't be taken away or dismissed with a joke, something that existed completely separate from my father's empire and his opinions. My diploma stayed folded in a drawer for years, tucked between old pay stubs and tax documents from early jobs. I couldn't bear to frame it, to put it on display where it would just remind me daily of that calculator, that laugh, that casual dismissal of 4 years of hard work. But I couldn't throw it away either. It represented too much, cost too much. So it lived in the dark, a reminder of everything my father had mocked while building his fortune on concepts he'd never bothered to understand. He'd always said accounting was just number crunching, implying it was beneath real business leadership. He didn't understand that numbers told stories, revealed lies, exposed the difference between what people claimed and what actually existed. Those supposedly boring spreadsheets I studied showed reality in ways his grand speeches never could. My education had taught me to see truth hiding in columns of figures. That skill was about to become very valuable. Then, 3 weeks ago, came the phone call that changed everything. My father's name appeared on my screen one Tuesday evening while I was reviewing a client's books. I almost didn't answer. We spoke maybe 4 times a year, always brief, always transactional. "Teresa," he said when I picked up, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Smaller somehow, less certain. "I need your help with something." Not a request. Not quite a demand either. Something in between, unfamiliar territory for a man who usually issued orders. "What kind of help?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral while my heart rate accelerated. "It's complicated. Legal matters involving your mother's estate. Nothing to worry about, just some papers that need signing." The explanation came too fast, too casual, hitting notes that felt rehearsed. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's all I need, just your signature on," I said. "I'll think about it." I hung up before he could respond. The truth was, I already knew I wouldn't save him. The decision had crystallized the moment I'd seen those financial statements attached to the lawyer's email. Years of falsified earnings reports. Loans taken against equipment that had been sold. Money borrowed from one account to cover shortfalls in another, an endless shell game that only worked until someone actually checked. My father had been cooking his books for at least a decade, maybe longer. He'd built his reputation on fraud, his success on lies, his empire on a foundation of paper and promises that dissolved under scrutiny. And now, facing bankruptcy and possible criminal charges, he wanted me to bail him out. Wanted me to sign over the one thing my mother had left me, the inheritance she'd specifically protected in her will from being absorbed into company assets. He wanted my complicity in his crimes. And he wanted me to provide it with a smile, gratefully, because family helped family. The next morning, I called Professor Anthony Caldwell. He'd been my favorite instructor at State University, the one who'd taught advanced financial analysis and somehow made debits and credits feel like detective work. He retired 3 years ago, but we kept in touch through occasional emails and coffee meetings. I met him at a small cafe near the university campus. He was grayer now, moved slower, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had made him such an effective teacher. "Teresa," he smiled, gesturing to the seat across from him. "It's been too long." We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes before I explained my situation, keeping my voice low, aware of other customers nearby. I showed him copies of the financial documents on my tablet, watched his expression shift from curiosity to concern to something like anger as he scrolled through the evidence of my father's fraud. "Don't rescue people who buried your worth," Professor Caldwell finally said, sliding my tablet back across the table. His coffee sat forgotten, steam rising in thin wisps. "I've seen this before. Family businesses where incompetence gets rewarded and competence gets exploited. Your father spent years telling you that your education was worthless, that your skills didn't matter. Now he needs those exact skills to save him, and he expects you to forget every insult." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Numbers don't lie, Teresa. People do. You know what's in those files. You know what signing those papers would make you." I nodded slowly, feeling something solid settle in my chest. "An accomplice." "Exactly. Choose carefully who deserves your accuracy, your integrity, your signature. Because once you give those things away, you can't get them back." I pulled out a napkin and wrote those words down. Numbers don't lie. People do. I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet. Over the next week, I did what I did best. I reviewed everything, every financial statement, every loan document, every creative accounting entry my father's bookkeepers had made over the years. I worked late into the night, my apartment silent except for the hum of my laptop and the occasional sound of traffic outside. Each spreadsheet told part of a larger story, a tale of systematic fraud dressed up as aggressive business strategy. Money diverted from payroll to cover executive bonuses. Equipment listed as assets that had been sold years ago. Revenue projections that bore no relationship to actual sales. It was masterful in its complexity, layers upon layers of deception that would take forensic accountants months to fully untangle. But the conclusion was simple: Vaughn Industries was built on lies, and those lies were finally catching up. Every fake transaction, every desperate loan, every creative interpretation of financial regulations painted a picture my father never wanted anyone to see. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold edges, Vaughn family Christmas dinner, formal attire requested. It came 2 weeks after my father's phone call, 1 week after I'd finished reviewing his company's books. The timing wasn't coincidental. This wasn't a holiday celebration, it was a stage, carefully set for a performance designed to pressure me into compliance. I knew exactly how it would play. The beautiful house, the expensive decorations, the reminder of everything his success had built. My brother playing his role as the golden child, the heir apparent who needed his sister to save their shared legacy. My father, charming and persuasive, making his case with all the force of his personality. They expected me to be the same person I'd always been, quiet, accommodating, ultimately cooperative despite any reservations. They had no idea that person had died the night I packed that cardboard box. I RSVP'd yes with a brief email and spent the next week preparing for war. The house smelled of pine and bourbon when I arrived on Christmas Eve. My father's home was a statement piece, all high ceilings and expensive art, the kind of place designed to impress rather than comfort. Garlands wrapped the staircase banister. A massive tree dominated the living room, decorated with ornaments that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My brother was already there, drink in hand, laughing at something on his phone. He looked up when I entered, gave me a brief nod that passed for acknowledgement. My father emerged from his study, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car had. "Teresa," he smiled, moving forward for an awkward hug that I tolerated rather than returned. "So glad you could make it." Dinner was catered, served on china that had belonged to my mother's grandmother. We made small talk, the kind of surface-level conversation that meant nothing. The whole thing felt choreographed, artificial, a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Then, as dessert was being cleared, my father slid a manila folder across the polished table toward me. It landed precisely in front of my place setting, the movement smooth and practiced. "Just a formality," he said, his voice carrying that tone of casual authority I'd heard my entire life. "Your mother's estate, as we discussed. The lawyers need your signature to finalize the restructuring." He pulled out a pen, expensive in gold, placed it beside the folder. Around the table, everyone waited. Kenneth watched with mild interest. My father's expression was confident, assured, the look of a man who'd never been denied anything he truly wanted. They expected me to open the folder, maybe ask a few questions, ultimately sign. I could see the script written in their expressions. Teresa, reliable and responsible, doing what needed to be done for the family. But I didn't touch the folder. Instead, I reached into my bag, my movements deliberate and slow. My pen stayed capped. I pulled out my diploma, the one that had spent years folded in a drawer. I'd had it professionally framed 2 days ago, simple black frame with museum-quality glass. The university seal gleamed under the dining room lights. Bachelor of Science in Accounting, summa cum laude. My name printed in formal script. I placed it carefully on the table beside my father's folder, the contrast stark. His papers represented fraud and desperation. My diploma represented 4 years of honest work, of learning truth from lies, of understanding that integrity wasn't negotiable regardless of consequences. "You said this meant nothing," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "You called it a waste of money. A pretty piece of paper. You gave me a calculator as a joke because accounting wasn't real business, wasn't leadership, wasn't worth your respect or investment." My father's confident expression flickered, confusion replacing certainty. "But now you need it more than anything you've built in 30 years. I kept my voice level, factual, letting the numbers speak for themselves the way Professor Caldwell had taught me. "You need my signature because your company is drowning. Because you've spent a decade falsifying records and taking loans against assets that don't exist. Because the banks are going to call those loans and discover you can't pay them back. Because bankruptcy is coming, and criminal charges might follow. And the only thing standing between you and complete collapse is my education, my credentials, my willingness to use my name and my professional reputation to legitimize your fraud." The room had gone completely silent. Even Kenneth had stopped looking at his phone. My father's face had lost all color, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "You need this piece of paper," I continued, touching the frame of my diploma, "to co-sign documents that will make me legally liable for your crimes." "Teresa," my father started, but I held up one hand. "I reviewed everything. Every financial statement, every loan document, every creative accounting entry. I spent 8 years building a reputation for honesty and accuracy. I will not destroy that to save you from consequences you earned." I stood, picking up my framed diploma, leaving his folder untouched on the table. "You said integrity was for people who couldn't afford to be practical. That rules were for small minds. That my education was worthless because I'd never understand real leadership. You were wrong. Leadership without integrity isn't leadership. It's just organized theft." My father finally found his voice. "If you don't sign, the company collapses. Hundreds of people lose their jobs. Your brother loses everything." "No," I said firmly. "If I don't sign, you face consequences for your choices. There's a difference." I folded my diploma carefully against my chest. Goodbye, Father. Then I walked out, my heels clicking against his expensive marble floors, the sound of my exit echoing through his silent house. 2 months later, I stood in my new office, breathing in the smell of fresh paint and possibility. Vaughn and Company Consulting occupied a small suite downtown, modest but professional. My diploma hung framed above my desk, morning sunlight making the glass shine. Beside it, I'd placed a photograph of my mother, taken before cancer had stolen her strength. She was smiling, genuine and warm. Every morning when I arrived, I looked at both of them and whispered the same words: worth isn't what you save. It's what you refuse to give away. My father's company had filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks after that Christmas dinner. The investigation was ongoing, but I'd heard through former colleagues that criminal charges were likely. Kenneth had found a job at another firm, his VP title meaning little without my father's connections to back it up. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, but I felt no guilt either. I'd made my choice. I'd chosen truth over family loyalty, integrity over obligation. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, genuinely free.